The Bible is filled with heroes whose stories have been forgotten. Today, we're bringing them back to life.
Stop it, Lord! Stop!
God showed him the future, and every vision was worse than the last.
Stop it, Lord! Stop!
He was only a shepherd from Judah. The land was filled with corruption, greed, and false worship. But one day, God called on him and told him to warn the people for their wrongdoings. But before he knew it, he was suddenly facing an entire nation. The sun had not yet risen over Tekoa. A shepherd stood among his flock, counting them one by one in the gray morning light, his staff resting against his shoulder. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence around him, a voice that did not come from any man standing near. It was the voice of God. "Go," the voice said. "Go to Israel." The shepherd froze. He was no one important. He was not a prophet's son. He was not trained in any school of prophets. He had no robe of office, no scroll of authority, nothing but his staff and his flock. But the voice did not ask twice. It commanded. And the shepherd, whose name was Amos, knew he had no choice but to obey. But to understand why this moment mattered so much, we must go back to the land Amos was about to leave and the land he was about to enter. Amos lived in the kingdom of Judah, in a small town called Tekoa. He spent his days tending sheep on the hills and caring for sycamore fig trees in the valleys. He was a simple man, living a simple life. But far to the north, in the kingdom of Israel, things were very different. Israel had become wealthy. Under King Jeroboam II, trade flourished, cities grew, and the rich built themselves beautiful houses. But underneath all that gold and comfort, something was rotting. The poor were being crushed. Judges took bribes. Merchants cheated with false scales. And worst of all, the people had twisted their worship of God, mixing it with golden calves that an earlier king had set up in a city called Bethel. They thought they were still serving the Lord. They were not. Amos rose before dawn the next day. He wrapped his cloak around his shoulders, took up his shepherd's staff, and looked one last time at his sheep grazing on the hills of Tekoa. Then he turned north and began to walk. But what he didn't know was that before he returned home, he would stand alone against an entire nation. He walked for many miles, through the dry hills of Judah, past small villages, until the land began to change beneath his feet. The roads grew busier. Merchants passed him with carts full of grain. Amos stood still for a moment, watching it all, before he raised his voice so that those nearby could hear him.
Hear this word, you cows of Bashan. The Lord God has sworn by his holiness that days are coming upon you. You will be taken away with hooks.
People turned to look. A stranger, dressed like a shepherd, was speaking as though he carried the authority of God. Amos began to speak of the nations surrounding Israel. He spoke of Damascus and how fire would fall upon it for its cruelty. He spoke of Gaza and of Tyre and of Edom and of Ammon and of Moab, naming their sins one after another. The crowd nodded along. Yes, they thought, those nations deserve judgment. Then Amos turned and spoke of Judah, Amos's own homeland, declaring that it too would be judged for rejecting God's law. The crowd murmured but still agreed. Judah was not their concern. Then Amos turned to face the people of Bethel directly. For 3 sins of Israel, he said, even 4, I will not turn back my wrath. The crowd fell silent. You sell the innocent for silver, Amos said, and the poor for a pair of sandals. You trample the needy into the dust. Father and son lie with the same woman, defiling my holy name. You lie on garments taken in pledge beside every altar and drink wine bought with fines wrongly collected. A merchant in the crowd clenched his fists. A priest standing near the altar looked away. No one had ever spoken to them this way inside the gates of Bethel. Amos did not stop there. In the days that followed, he walked through the streets and the marketplaces, watching how the wealthy lived. He saw men reclining on beds carved with ivory, drinking wine from large bowls while musicians played for them. Just beyond their walls in the alleys, the poor lay hungry. Amos stood at the edge of the market one afternoon and spoke again. "Woe to you who lie on beds of ivory," he said, "who eat the fattest lambs and drink the finest wine, while the poor of this land are crushed beneath your feet. The Lord has sworn the time is coming when you will be carried away." He looked toward a group of wealthy women standing near the well, dressed in fine linen, calling for their servants to bring them more wine. Amos lifted his hand toward them.
Hear this, you cows of Bashan!
Before we continue, these videos takes hours and hours to make. If you could, please like and subscribe and comment which country you are watching this from. Do you want to learn how to make these videos? Go to my YouTube page and watch the member-only video. I provide all the prompts I use, tools I use, and how I animate.
He said, "You who oppress the poor and crush the needy, who say to your husbands, 'Bring us more to drink.' The day is coming when you will be dragged out of this city like cattle through gaps in the wall." The women turned away from him, scandalized. But Amos did not care for their anger. He had only one purpose now, and that was to speak the words given to him. Many in Bethel believed that a day was coming when God would lift Israel above all nations, a day they called the Day of the Lord. They spoke of it with joy, expecting light and victory. Amos warned them otherwise. "Why do you long for the day of the Lord?" he said. "That day will bring darkness, not light. It will be as though a man runs from a lion only to meet a bear, or escapes into his house only to be bitten by a snake hiding in the wall." After the king's share of the harvest had already been taken, after this, in a quiet moment, the Lord showed Amos a vision. He saw a great swarm of locusts forming over the land, ready to devour every green plant. Amos fell to his knees. "Sovereign Lord," he cried out, "forgive! How can Israel survive? She is so small." And the Lord relented, and the locusts did not come. Then Amos saw another vision. Fire calling for judgment, beginning to consume the land, he cried, and the deep waters beneath. "How can Israel survive? Again, she is so small." And again, the Lord relented. But then came a third vision, different from the others. Amos saw the Lord standing beside a wall, holding in his hand a plumb line, the cord and weight builders use to test whether a wall stands straight. The Lord turned to Amos. "What do you see?" he asked. "A plumb line," Amos answered. "I am setting a plumb line among my people Israel," the Lord said. "I will spare them no longer." This time Amos did not beg. He understood that the wall of Israel had grown too crooked, and no pleading would straighten it now. This vision is recorded in the 7th chapter of the book of Amos. It was not long after this vision that a man named Uzziah, the priest of Bethel, came striding through the crowd toward Amos. "Get out!" pointing toward the road leading south. "Go back to Judah, you seer! Earn your bread there and prophesy there. Do not prophesy any more at Bethel." Amaziah did not stop there. He sent a messenger to King Jeroboam himself warning the king that a man named Amos was stirring up the people and speaking against the throne. Amos stood firm before the priest. "I was not a prophet," Amos said, "nor the son of a prophet. I was a shepherd, and I took care of sycamore fig trees. But the Lord took me from tending the flock and said to me, 'Go, prophesy to my people Israel.'" Then Amos looked directly at Amaziah, and his voice grew heavier. "Now then, hear the word of the Lord. You say, 'Do not prophesy against Israel.' Therefore, this is what the Lord says. Your wife will become a prostitute in this city. Your sons and daughters will fall by the sword. Your land will be measured and divided up, and you yourself will die in a foreign land. And Israel will surely go into exile away from their native land." Amaziah's face went pale, but he said nothing more. He turned and walked away through the crowd, leaving Amos standing alone near the altar. In the days that followed, the Lord gave Amos one more vision. He saw a basket of ripe summer fruit. "What do you see?" the Lord asked. "A basket of ripe fruit," Amos answered. "The time is ripe for my people Israel," the Lord said. "I will spare them no longer." Amos understood. The harvest was ready, and so was the judgment. In a final vision, Amos saw the Lord standing beside the altar itself, the very place where the people brought their sacrifices, believing themselves safe. But the Lord gave the command to strike the tops of the pillars so that the thresholds would shake, and none of the people would be able to flee. Amos delivered every word given to him. He warned that a nation would rise up and oppress Israel from one end of the land to the other, and that the people would be carried away into exile beyond the borders they knew. This warning of exile is recorded in the 6th and 7th chapters of the book of Amos. Years later, the army of Assyria would march into the land, exactly as Amos had spoken, and carry the people of Israel away into captivity. But before Amos turned to leave Bethel for the last time, he spoke once more to the crowd that had gathered. And this time, his words were not of judgment. "In that day," he said, "I will restore David's fallen tent. I will repair its broken walls and restore its ruins. I will build it as it used to be. I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted. They will rebuild the ruined cities and live in them. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine. They will make gardens and eat their fruit." With those words spoken, Amos turned from the altar at Bethel, gathered his cloak around him, and walked back through the gates the way he had come, down the long road toward Tekoa, back to the hills where his sheep still waited for him. One wrong move, and the king would die. Israel had suffered under Moab for 18 years, but one man walked into the king's palace carrying a hidden blade. Then he asked to speak with the king alone. Ehud was a man from the tribe of Benjamin, the son of a man named Gera. He had grown up in a household where most boys were taught from childhood to strap their swords to the left side of their belt, training their right hand to draw fast and strike hard. But Ehud's strength had always lived in his left hand, and so as a boy he had learned to do everything backward from the men around him, tying his sandals with his left fingers first, throwing stones with his left arm, lifting and carrying with the side of his body that others considered weak. No one around him ever thought much of it. It simply made him different, a small detail about a man that no one paid attention to. For 18 years, the land of Israel lived bent beneath the rule of Moab. King Eglon had grown strong, and every season the men of the villages gathered their grain into sacks, poured their oil into jars, and counted out silver that was no longer theirs to keep. Donkeys were loaded heavy at the start of the journey and led back home light and empty. Ehud watched this happen year after year, watched his neighbors hand over what they had worked the soil for, and he lived under that same weight like everyone else around him. But what he didn't know was that the very years he spent silently watching his people suffer were preparing him to become the one who would end it. The people of Israel finally lifted their voice and cried out to the Lord because of what King Eglon had done. And the Lord heard their cry and raised up Ehud to be their deliverer. Ehud rose early one morning and walked out to the small forge behind his home. He pulled a strip of raw iron from where it had been resting near the coals and laid it across the flat stone. He took up his hammer with his left hand and began to strike the metal again and again, turning it, flattening it, working the heat out of it slowly until the iron began to take shape. He worked through the heat of the day, stopping only to wipe the sweat from his brow, until at last he held in his hand a blade with two sharp edges, no longer than the length of his own forearm, light enough to be hidden, sharp enough to do what he intended. That evening, Ehud took a long strip of cloth and wound it tightly around his right thigh. He slid the blade beneath the wrapped cloth, adjusted it until it sat flat against his leg, and let his outer robe fall down over it. He walked a few steps across the room, turned, swung his arm the way a man might swing it, and felt nothing shift or catch beneath the fabric. He sat down, stood up again, bent low to pick something off the floor, and still the blade stayed hidden. The day came when the tribute was to be carried to King Eglon. Ehud walked out to where the donkeys were being loaded, checked the straps holding the sacks of grain in place, and tightened one that had come loose. He called out to the men gathered with him.
Men, the time has come. Let the tribute journey begin.
Yes, Ehud!
We are ready. Lift it steady now. Follow me.
They lifted the last of the silver onto the final donkey, and together the group set out from the village, walking down the dirt road that led out past the fields and toward the border. The road stretched on through dry hills and shallow valleys, the donkeys kicking up dust with every step, the sun climbing higher overhead as the day wore on, and continued on until, far in the distance, the walls of the Moabite palace began to rise up against the sky. As they drew closer, the gates of the city came into clear view, tall and guarded, with soldiers standing on either side watching every traveler who approached. When Ehud and his men reached the gates, the guards stepped forward and began searching each man before allowing him through, running their hands firmly along the left side of every traveler's body, feeling for the shape of a hidden blade. When it came to Ehud's turn, the guard ran his hands along his left hip, found nothing, and motioned him forward without a second glance. They were led through the courtyard and brought into the hall where King Eglon sat upon his throne, his body heavy and broad, his eyes following the donkeys as they were brought in one at a time. The sacks of grain were untied and poured out before him. The jars of oil were set down in a row. The silver was counted out and stacked at his feet. Eglon leaned forward, looking over the wealth being presented to him, nodding slowly with satisfaction at what his rule over a smaller nation continued to bring him. But what Eglon didn't know, sitting there counting his silver, was that the very tribute being laid out before his feet would be the last he would ever receive from anyone.
Before we continue, these videos takes hours and hours to make. If you could, please like and subscribe and comment which country you are watching this from.
When the last of the goods had been presented and counted, Ehud bowed before the king, turned, and led his men back out through the hall, through the courtyard, and out through the gates they had entered by. They walked back down the road the way they had come, the empty donkeys moving lighter and faster now, They walked on for some time, putting good distance between themselves and the palace walls, until Ehud finally slowed his pace and came to a stop. He turned to the men walking beside him and said, "Go on ahead without me. I have something left to finish here." The men looked at him for a moment, but did not question him further. They nodded, turned, and continued down the road together. Ehud stood in the road and watched them go until they grew small in the distance, and then he turned around and began walking back the way he had come, alone now. He reached the gates a second time that same day. The same guards who had searched him hours earlier stepped forward again, running their hands along his left side, just as they had before, finding nothing there and waving him through without suspicion. He walked through the courtyard, past the columns, until he came to the smaller chamber near the quarry of Gilgal, where King Eglon had withdrawn to rest in the cool of the afternoon. Ehud approached and bowed low before him. "I have a secret message for you, O king," he said quietly. Eglon lifted his hand and turned to the attendant standing near him. "Leave us," he commanded. The guards filed out one by one. The servants set down what they were carrying and stepped through the door. The heavy wooden doors swung shut, and the room fell into a thick silence, leaving only the king and Ehud standing together inside. Ehud stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "I have a message from God for you." Eglon began to rise from his throne, leaning forward, placing his weight onto his feet to stand and receive whatever word had been sent to him. In that same instant, Ehud's left hand moved fast, reaching beneath the folds of his robe, closing around the handle of the hidden blade. He drove it forward with full strength, the blade sinking deep into the king's body. Eglon's weight fell backward, and the blade sank in so far, the wound closing tightly around it, so that Ehud could not pull it free again, even if he had tried. He stepped back, turned, walked across the chamber to a side door that opened onto a porch, and stepped through it into the open air. He pulled the heavy door of the chamber shut behind him, took hold of the lock, and turned it firmly into place, sealing the room closed. He walked on across the porch and down the steps, moving back through the same halls he had passed through only moments before. He walked past the very guards who had let him through the gates twice that day. His pace slow and even, he passed through the courtyard, through the gates, and out onto the open road, the palace walls slowly falling behind him. Only once the walls had grown distant did he quicken his stride, moving faster now, putting one road behind him after another. He walked on through the lowlands as the sun began its slow drop toward the horizon, the ground beneath his feet beginning to rise the further he went, climbing higher into the hill country of Ephraim. He pressed on past rocky slopes and scattered trees, his legs aching from the distance already covered that day, until at last he reached a high ridge where the land spread out wide and visible below him in every direction. There, Ehud lifted a trumpet to his lips and blew it, the sound carrying far out across the valleys and hillsides. Men in the villages below lifted their heads at the sound, stepped out from their homes, and began climbing the slopes toward the high ridge where the call had come from. They gathered around him in growing numbers, more arriving with every passing moment, until a large crowd of Israelite men stood waiting before him.
Men of Israel, the time for action is now.
We are with you!
We will drive them from our land, for our freedom.
The men began moving down from the hills together, following close behind him as he led the way toward the Jordan River. They moved quickly across the lower ground, reaching the river before any word of what had happened in the palace could travel ahead of them. Ehud and his men spread out along the fords of the Jordan, the only crossings the fleeing Moabite soldiers could use to escape back to their own land. And they stood there waiting, weapons ready, watching the far side of the river. Back inside the palace, the guards stationed outside Eglon's locked chamber waited through the afternoon, assuming their king had simply chosen to rest alone behind the closed doors. But what those guards didn't know was that their king was already lying dead on the floor inside. Eventually, growing uneasy at the prolonged silence, the guards took hold of a key and forced the chamber doors open. They stepped inside and found their king lying still on the floor. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the palace and out into the surrounding camps, reaching the Moabite soldiers just as they began scrambling toward the river crossings to flee back toward their own territory. When the Moabite soldiers reached the fords of the Jordan, they found Ehud and the men of Israel already standing there, blocking every path across the water. The fighting that followed was fierce but did not last long. Israel struck down about 10,000 Moabite men that day along the banks of the river, strong and capable soldiers, every one of them. Yet not a single man among them managed to escape across to the other side. Moab was subdued under the hand of Israel that day, and the long years of carrying tribute across that border, the years of bowing before a foreign king's demands, came to an end. The fields of Israel were planted that season without fear of the harvest being carried away. The roads were walked without dread of Moabite soldiers waiting along them. For 80 years, the land remained at rest, one of the longest stretches of peace recorded in that age, the fruit of one quiet, left-handed man. One mission, and his life would change forever. A simple man got the task from Moses to be a spy. His mission was to explore the land God had promised Israel. But when he arrived, he saw something that made the whole Israel tremble in fear. But to understand how he got to that town and who those people were, we must first go back to the beginning of Caleb's story. He was just a leader from the tribe of Judah, nothing more. He didn't carry a crown. He didn't carry an army of his own. But he was about to walk into a land filled with giants. His name was Caleb, and this is not just a story about a spy. It is the story of the one man who never let fear control him. Moses called 12 men forward, one from each tribe of Israel, to stand before him at the edge of the camp. Caleb was one of them. The mission was simple but terrifying. Walk into Canaan, the land God had promised, and see what was waiting there. Moses gave them clear instructions. See what the land is like. See whether the people living in it are strong or weak, few or many. See whether the cities are open or fortified with walls, and bring back some of the fruit of the land. Caleb packed dried bread and a skin of water, tied them to his belt, gathered his staff, and set out with the other 11 men toward the north. But what he didn't know was that giants were waiting for him. The 12 men crossed the dry wilderness on foot, climbing rocky hills under the scorching sun, resting only when the heat became too much to bear. They moved carefully once they crossed into Canaan itself, staying off the main roads, keeping to the edges of fields and the shadows of hillsides, so they would not be noticed by the people living there. They watched cities from a distance before walking close enough to study their walls and gates, careful never to draw attention to themselves. Day after day, they pushed further north, slipping past settlements unseen, until they reached the region of Hebron, and there they froze. Standing near the gates were men taller than anything they had ever seen, their shoulders wide as door frames, their arms thick as the trunks of young trees, their spears taller than any spear carried by a soldier in Israel's camp. These were the sons of Anak, and the sight of them sent fear into the hearts of most of the 12. The spies did not stay near Hebron long. They kept moving, careful and quiet, slipping past fields and settlements until they reached the valley of Eshcol. There, hanging low from heavy vines, was a single cluster of grapes so massive that 2 men had to cut a pole, slide it through the stem, and carry it balanced between their shoulders. They gathered pomegranates and figs alongside it, wrapping them carefully so the fruit would survive the long walk back. With their evidence gathered, the 12 men turned south again, retracing their steps through the hills and across the dry wilderness, until 40 days after they had first set out, the camp of Israel came back into view. When they returned, the whole nation gathered to hear what they had seen. The spies held up the heavy cluster of grapes for everyone to look at. Caleb held nothing back. He told the people the land was good, that they were well able to take it, and that the Lord who brought them out of Egypt would give them the victory. But 10 of the other spies spoke differently. They spoke of the giants in Hebron, of cities surrounded by towering walls, of nations too strong and too numerous to defeat. They said the men of Israel would look like grasshoppers next to the people living in that land. Fear spread through the camp like fire through dry grass, passing from tent to tent until the whole assembly was weeping and crying out. The people began to cry out, ready to choose new leaders and turn back toward Egypt instead of facing what lay ahead of them. Caleb stepped forward in front of everyone, standing beside Joshua. He raised his voice over the weeping crowd and told them not to be afraid, that the Lord who had parted the sea and brought them safely out of Egypt would surely give them this land. Joshua tore his clothes in grief at what the other 10 had said and stood with Caleb, pleading with the people to trust God instead of fear. But the people would not listen. They picked up stones from the ground, ready to kill both men right there in front of the whole camp. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting, and his anger burned against the people for their unbelief.
Before we continue, these videos take hours and hours to make. If you could please like and subscribe and comment which country you are watching from.
He declared that because they had refused to trust him after everything they had seen him do, none of that generation, 20 years old and upward, would live to enter the promised land. They would wander instead through the wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for every day the spies had spent in Canaan, until every one of them had died in the desert. Only 2 men among that entire generation would be allowed to enter the land. Those 2 men were Caleb and Joshua. For the next 40 years, Caleb watched the wilderness swallow his entire generation. Camp after camp was set up and torn down again, moving from place to place across the dry land. Grave after grave was dug in the sand until almost no one remained who remembered the giants of Hebron the way he did. Caleb grew older through those years, watching the friends he had grown up with die one by one, exactly as God had said. But Caleb never forgot what he had seen with his own eyes. He carried that promise inside him like a fire that refused to go out, waiting patiently through every long, dry year for the day God had spoken of. 40 years passed, and the wilderness generation was finally gone. Moses died on the mountain overlooking the land of Canaan, never setting foot inside it himself. Joshua took his place leading the people. The army of Israel crossed the Jordan River on dry ground, marched against the city of Jericho, watched its massive walls collapse after 7 days, and began moving through the land, city by city, claiming the territory God had promised to give them so many years before. One of the most interesting parts of Caleb's life came many years later, after Israel had crossed the Jordan and Joshua had become their leader. Most of the land had already been divided among the tribes of Israel by that time. Caleb, now 85 years old, walked up to Joshua at Gilgal and reminded him of a promise made decades earlier at Kadesh Barnea. He told Joshua how Moses had sworn an oath that day, that because he had remained faithful and unafraid when the other spies gave in to fear, the land of Hebron, the very place where the giants once stood, would belong to him and his descendants forever. Joshua listened, remembered the oath, and blessed Caleb, granting him Hebron as his inheritance. But Hebron was not empty when Caleb arrived to claim it. The same 3 giants Caleb had seen as a young man still ruled the city. Their names were Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, sons of Anak, the very giants whose size had once made the rest of Israel tremble with fear. Caleb called together his brothers and his kinsmen from the tribe of Judah, gathered weapons and supplies, and assembled his men at the edge of the hill country. Caleb led his men out at dawn, walking the long road up into the hills toward Hebron. They carried their weapons slung over their shoulders, moving steadily through the dry terrain, past fields and small settlements, until the walls of Hebron finally came into view, sitting on its hill, exactly as Caleb remembered it from 45 years before. The same gates, the same high walls, the same land that had once filled an entire nation with terror. Word of Israel's victories had already spread through the land. The fall of Jericho, the fall of Ai, city after city falling one after another. And fear had begun to creep into Hebron, long before Caleb's men ever reached its gates. The sons of Anak, accustomed to ruling over every nation around them, without challenge, gathered what defenders they had and prepared to make their stand, certain that no army from the wilderness could stand against men of their size and strength. Caleb gathered his men just outside the city and gave the order to advance. They moved forward together, surrounding the approaches to Hebron, cutting off every road the giants might use to escape or call for help from neighboring cities. Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai stood at the front of their people, towering over every man around them, certain their size alone would be enough to break the army marching toward their gates. But Caleb did not stop. He led his men forward, pressing into the city, street by street, gate by gate, refusing to be driven back by the sheer size of the men standing against him. The fighting stretched on as Caleb's men pushed deeper into Hebron, forcing the giants back through their own streets, past their own homes, toward the far edge of the city they had ruled for generations. Slowly, the towering sons of Anak were driven out, first from the gates, then from the city itself, until they had nothing left to stand on but the open hills beyond Hebron's walls. Caleb and his men did not stop pursuing them until the giants were fully driven out of the land, far from the city that would now belong to Caleb and his family. This is recorded in the book of Joshua, chapter 15, where it says, Caleb drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak. The same account is repeated again in the book of Judges, confirming that Judah, with Caleb leading them, went up against Hebron and drove out the giants who had ruled it for generations. With the giants gone, Caleb walked through the gates of the city he had first seen 45 years earlier, as a frightened young spy among 11 other men, too afraid to believe what their own eyes had shown them. Caleb did not stop there. Even after Hebron was secured, he turned his attention to the surrounding land, calling his family together and encouraging them to press further into the hill country and take hold of what still remained. He offered his daughter Achsah in marriage to whoever would go up and capture the nearby city of Debir. His relative Othniel rose to the challenge, leading his men against the city, taking it and receiving Achsah as his wife in return. Through this, the family of Caleb continued spreading across the hill country of Judah, claiming more and more of the land that had once seemed impossible to take. Caleb's portion of land became known throughout Israel as a lasting reminder of what it meant to trust God completely, even when everyone else gave in to fear. Manasseh was the son of King Hezekiah, born into a palace where no idols remained, after Hezekiah destroyed every idol. As a boy, he was taught to pray facing the temple, to bow his head before meals, to recite the words his father recited every morning before the sun had fully risen. Each year during the feast, his father walked him by the hand through the temple courts, stopping to explain what each offering meant and why the altar stood where it stood. His father took him as a small child to watch the priests at the altar, lifting him onto his shoulders so he could see over the heads of the crowd gathered in the courts of the Lord. No one around him thought twice about the silent prince. They believed they were watching the son of a faithful king grow into a faithful man. Instead, they were watching Judah's darkest chapter quietly begin. Hezekiah ruled Judah for many years, tearing down every high place where the nations once burned incense to gods that were not the Lord, smashing the carved images his own forefathers had set up across the hills. He trusted the Lord even when the army of Assyria camped outside the walls of Jerusalem itself. Manasseh grew up inside the years that followed that victory, walking the same halls his father walked, watching him kneel before the Lord in the same room every evening before he slept, never knowing what he would one day become. But Hezekiah grew sick, and then he grew old, and then he died, and the crown of Judah was placed on the head of his son. Manasseh was 12 years old the day he sat down on his father's throne for the first time. At first, the people of Judah did not know what kind of king they had been given. But it did not take long to find out. A group of officials came to the young king. These were men who had served under Hezekiah, but had buried their old gods in the ground, rather than burn them the way the king had once commanded. They stood before Manasseh and spoke carefully, choosing their words. "Your father tore down what our fathers built. The nations around us still worship freely. Why should Judah alone go without idols?" One of the older men leaned in further. "You are young. No one expects you to carry the same burden your father carried. Let the people have back what was taken from them." Manasseh listened to them in silence for a long while. Then he called for his builders. "Rebuild the high places my father tore down. Raise the altars again on every hill." Workers went out across the kingdom carrying tools and stone. They found the broken altars his father had smashed apart, lying scattered in the hill country, and they lifted the stones back into place one on top of another until the altars stood as tall as they once had. New altars rose beside the old ones in the valleys and outside the gates of every town in Judah. Smoke began climbing into the sky again, smoke from offerings burned to Baal. Manasseh called for craftsmen and had them carve a wooden image of Asherah, tall and smooth, polished until it gleamed in the lamplight. When it was finished, he did not send it out to some distant shrine. He had it carried through the streets of Jerusalem, through the gates of the temple, and set down inside the very house his father had once swept clean. Priests who still served the Lord in that same building watched it carried past them and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say to a king who would not listen. At night, Manasseh climbed to the roof of his palace and looked up at the stars scattered across the sky. He bowed low before them and called for altars to be built inside the temple courts for the sun, the moon, and all the host of heaven, set up in the very same courts where the priests once burned incense to the Lord alone. He called for mediums next, men who claimed they could speak with the dead, and let them into his own palace. One of them knelt before him in a small chamber thick with smoke and said, "Ask me, and the spirits of the dead will answer through my mouth." Manasseh leaned forward and asked him to call up the dead so he could learn what was coming. He called for sorcerers too, men who read the future in the entrails of animals. Manasseh listened to every word they spoke. Whether their answers were lies or empty promises, he believed them more than the voice of the Lord. And Manasseh became a grown man. But as he grew older, his heart only drifted farther from the Lord. There was a valley just outside the walls of Jerusalem, where fires burned day and night, fires lit for a god called Molech. Manasseh walked down into that valley himself one evening, leading his own young son by the hand. The priests there built the fire high. Manasseh lifted his son and gave him to the flames. The same act the nations before him had once done in that same valley. The very practice the Lord had driven those nations out of the land for doing. The Lord did not stay silent through any of this.
Before we continue, these videos takes hours and hours to make. If you could, please like and subscribe and comment which country you are watching this from.
He sent his prophets into the streets of Jerusalem to speak against what the king had done.
Hear the word of the Lord! Repent, for judgment is at hand. Turn from your ways!
Because of this, the Lord will bring such disaster on Jerusalem that everyone who hears of it will be stunned. Manasseh ordered the man brought before him.
You dare stand before me?
The prophet did not lower his eyes. I bring no curse of my own, I only speak what the Lord has given me to speak. Manasseh's anger did not cool. Take him away, let him speak no more. From that day forward, anyone who spoke against the king or tried to turn the people back to the Lord was hunted down through the streets and silenced. So much blood was spilled across Jerusalem in those years that it was said to have filled the city from one end to the other. This part of the story is written in the book of 2 Kings, chapter 21. But what Manasseh did not know, sitting on his throne surrounded by carved idols and a silenced people, was that far to the east, beyond the rivers and beyond the mountains, a mighty empire was already watching the smaller kingdoms around it grow weak from within. Assyria had not forgotten Judah, and the day was coming when the Lord would use that very empire as the hand of his judgment against the king who had refused every warning sent to him. One of the most interesting parts of Manasseh's life began on a morning that started out like any other in Jerusalem. Merchants opening their stalls, farmers leading their animals through the gates, children running between the carts on their way to the well. But before the sun had climbed halfway across the sky, riders came down the northern road at a hard gallop, shouting as they passed through the gates. The army of Assyria has crossed into Judah. Their commanders are marching straight toward Jerusalem. Manasseh called his officials and commanders into the palace hall. Gather every man who can carry a weapon. Close the gates. We will not bow to Assyria.
By order of the king,
Soldiers ran through the streets, banging on doors, calling out, "Men of Judah, take up your weapons! The king commands us to stand!" Men grabbed spears and shields from inside their homes and ran for the walls. The gates were sealed shut with heavy beams, and watchmen climbed the towers to count the enemy gathering in the distance. The Assyrian army moved across the land like a flood, town after town falling under their advance, breaking through one outer defense after another until their commanders surrounded Jerusalem on every side. The fighting inside the city did not last long. Assyrian soldiers broke through the gates and stormed the palace, dragging Manasseh out from behind his own throne. His royal robes were torn off. Outside the walls, the soldiers forced him down onto his knees, drove a sharp hook through his nose, and bound his wrists with heavy bronze shackles. Then they tied a rope to the hook and pulled him forward, leading him out through the gates of Jerusalem and onto the long road east toward Babylon. For many days, Manasseh walked that road, crossing dry plains under the sun. The soldiers stopped at wells along the way to drink their fill while he waited in the dirt with his wrists still bound. At night they tied him to a post and let him sleep on the bare ground. Children in the small villages they passed ran to the roadside just to see the captive king of Judah stumble by with a rope through his nose. They crossed a wide river on a narrow bridge of timber, the soldiers laughing as they shoved him forward, and continued through flat farmland dotted with date palms until the towering gates of Babylon rose up in the distance. Inside the city, they marched him through crowded streets past temples built to gods he did not know, and shut him inside a prison built deep into the city wall. In that cell, with no throne, no crown, and no idols left to call out to, Manasseh thought back to his father kneeling in prayer inside the very palace he himself had filled with foreign altars. He thought of the mediums who could not loosen a single chain, the sorcerers who could not tell him how many days he had left. Night after night, alone in the dark, he lowered his head and prayed, "Lord God of my fathers, I have sinned against you. I have filled this land with idols and filled its streets with innocent blood. But if you will hear me even now, I will never turn from you again." This part of the story is recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 33. Word eventually came down through the Babylonian court that the captive king of Judah was to be released. Guards unlocked the shackles from his wrists and pulled the hook from his nose. A horse was brought for him, the first kindness shown to him in a long time. Manasseh climbed onto it and rode out through the gates of Babylon. When he reached the gates of his own city, the people gathered to see their king return. He did not go first to his throne. He walked straight to the temple of the Lord, and with his own hands he tore down the carved image and ordered it carried out beyond the walls. He turned to his officials.
Every pagan altar on the hills of Judah must be destroyed.
It will be done, my lord.
Go now, purify the land.
Workers went out across the kingdom, smashing apart what Manasseh himself had once ordered built. He gathered builders and had the outer wall of the city of David rebuilt and strengthened, stretching it from the spring of Gihon up to the western hill. He sent commanders to take charge of the fortified cities across Judah and stationed soldiers in each one, so the kingdom would never again be caught as undefended as it had been the day Assyria marched through unopposed. He reigned 55 years on the throne of Judah, longer than any king before him, from the day he was crowned at 12 years old until the day he died. He was buried in the garden of his own palace, the same garden where he had once burned incense to gods. His son Amon took the throne after him. But Amon had never walked that road to Babylon. Amon sat on the throne of Judah for only 2 years before his own officials turned against him inside his own palace and ended his life there. As the Israelites cried out to God, one man stepped forward to answer that prayer. A simple man watched as a foreign king turned Israel into a mockery. But Othniel didn't feel fear. He felt furious. So he walked to the very front line and challenged the army of Aram Naharaim. It was winter in the hill country, and smoke was rising from a city called Debir. Othniel stood at the edge of the camp, watching it burn. His sword was still wet from fighting. Around him, the men of Judah waited to see who would step forward next. An old man named Caleb called out to the soldiers, "Whoever attacks this city and takes it, I will give him my daughter Aksa as his wife." Caleb was old, but he had walked through the desert with Moses long ago. He had seen giants and was never afraid of them. The soldiers looked at each other. No one moved, but Othniel did not wait. He turned to the men near him and said,
Follow me! We will take this city today!
He picked up his shield and walked toward the city gate. But to understand how he got here, we must go back to where his story began. Othniel was the son of Kenaz and the younger brother of Caleb. He grew up training with a sword, while other young men stayed safe near their tents. He learned how to fight, and he learned how to be brave. When the people of Israel came into the land of Canaan, they were given the hill country to live in. But many cities in that land still belonged to other people. People who did not want to leave. One of those cities was called Kiriath Sefer, and its walls were strong. Before the army marched, Othniel sat outside his tent the night before, sharpening his sword on a flat stone. The fire in front of him was small, just enough to see by. His brother Caleb walked over and sat beside him, watching him work the blade. Caleb did not say much. He simply looked at the city far in the distance, its walls dark against the night sky, and then looked back at his younger brother. Othniel kept sharpening, the sound of stone against metal filling the quiet between them. When the blade was sharp enough, he set it down beside him and looked up at the stars, waiting for the morning. When the sun rose, Othniel stood and tied his sandals tight. He picked up his shield from where it leaned against a rock, and he walked toward the men who were gathering near the edge of the camp. They were checking their spears, tightening straps on their arms, filling water skins for the day ahead. Othniel walked among them, and he walked up the dirt road toward the city. The sun was hot above him. As he got closer, he could see men standing on top of the wall, watching him come. He raised his hand, and the soldiers behind him spread out near the wall. The men on top of the wall shouted down and threw stones, but Othniel kept walking. He reached the gate. He looked back at the men carrying a heavy log and said, "Break it down! Do not stop until it falls!" They swung the log against the wooden doors again and again until the wood cracked open. Othniel ran through the broken gate first. Inside, the fighting was close and hard. Men pushing through narrow streets between stone houses, shields knocking against each other in the tight spaces. But by the end of the day, the city belonged to Judah. Othniel walked back to his brother's tent, still covered in dust. Caleb kept his promise. He gave his daughter Achsah to Othniel as his wife. Achsah remembered her father had also promised her land with water on it. Since the ground near the city was dry, she went to her father and said, "Father, give me springs of water, for the land you gave me is dry." Caleb gave her the springs nearby. Othniel built a home on that land, near the springs his wife had asked for. In the cool part of the morning, before the sun grew strong, Achsah would walk down to the spring with a clay jar resting on her shoulder, filling it with water for the day. Othniel would often walk with her part way, carrying nothing, simply enjoying the quiet before the work of the day began. But while Othniel built a peaceful life, darkness was quietly returning to Israel.
Before we continue, these videos takes hours and hours to make. If you could, please like and subscribe and comment which country you are watching this from. Do you want to learn how to make these videos? Go to my YouTube page and watch the member-only video. I provide all the prompts I use, tools I use, and how I animate.
In the evenings, they sat together outside their tent, eating bread and olives, and Othniel would tell her small pieces of the battle at Kiriath Sefer, things he had not had time to speak of before. Their land had grain fields nearby, and Othniel spent many seasons walking those fields, watching the grain grow tall, then watching his men gather it in at harvest. Othniel now had land, a wife, and a name people knew throughout the tribe of Judah. Years passed in this way, quiet and full. Othniel grew older, his hair turning gray, his hands rougher from years of working the land instead of fighting wars. But the people of Israel began to forget God. They started living near the people who did not believe in him. And slowly, without seeming to notice it happening, they began to worship false gods made of wood and stone, gods that other nations bowed before. Othniel watched this happen from a distance, shaking his head at the altars built on hillsides near his own home. But the people did not listen to the old judges and elders who warned them. So God let a powerful king come against them, a king from the east, named Cushan-Rishathaim. His army marched into Israel, taking city after city. He placed his own men over the towns, and the people had to give him their grain and their silver every year. This went on for 8 years. Mothers watched their sons taken away to work for this king. Farmers grew food only to watch it taken from them by soldiers who came at harvest time, loading carts with grain that should have fed their own children through the winter. In the town nearest Othniel's home, an officer of the foreign king set up a post by the gate, counting every basket that passed through, taking a share for his king before anyone else could eat. Finally, the people could not bear it any longer, and they cried out to God, saying, "Lord, save us from this king, for we cannot bear this any longer." By this time, Othniel was an old man, living quietly with his wife on his land. One evening, he sat outside his tent with Uzziah, the fire low between them, eating a simple meal of bread and lentils. She noticed he had grown quiet, staring past the fire toward the hills, where smoke still rose from towns under the foreign king's hand. She set down her bread and touched his arm gently, but said nothing, knowing the weight that was on him. That night, as Othniel lay down to sleep, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. He woke before the sun rose, sat up suddenly and looked toward the corner of the tent where, hanging on a wooden peg, his old sword had rested untouched for many years. He rose, walked over to it, and lifted it down. Dust had gathered along the blade. He sat by the fire, taking a cloth, and slowly began to wipe the years of dust away, his fingers moving carefully along the edge he had once kept so sharp. Uzziah woke and watched him from where she lay. "You mean to fight again?" she said quietly. Othniel did not look up from the blade. "The Lord has put it in me. I cannot sit while our people suffer." She rose and brought him bread for the road ahead, wrapping it in cloth without another word, because she had been the daughter of Caleb, and she knew what it meant when a man was called to fight. He walked outside and sent word to the towns of Judah, calling men to come and fight. Riders went from village to village, telling farmers in their fields and shepherds with their flocks that Othniel, the one who had taken Kiriath-Sepher long ago, was calling men to war again. Men left their farms and picked up their old weapons, blowing dust off shields that had hung on walls for years, sharpening spear tips that had gone dull from disuse. They walked from their homes along dry paths and gathered together near a wide field outside the hills until there were many of them standing in one place, the sound of their voices and the clatter of their gear filling the open ground. Othniel walked among them, checking that each man had a weapon fit for the road ahead, stopping here and there to tighten a strap or test the edge of a blade with his thumb. When they were ready, he stood before them and said, "Men, gather close. We go now to fight this king and free our people. Do not be afraid." They gave a shout and began to march north toward the land where the enemy king's men were stationed. The march was long, through dry riverbeds where no water ran, and over rocky hills that slowed their pace. At night they camped under the open sky, small fires scattered across the ground, men resting their tired feet and eating what bread they had carried. Scouts went ahead of the army each day, moving quietly through the hills, and came back each night with news, telling Othniel where the enemy soldiers were, and how many of them there were, which roads they guarded, and where they slept without much watch kept over their camp. Othniel listened by the fire each night and made his plan, sometimes staying awake long after his men had fallen asleep. When the two armies finally stood facing each other across an open field, the enemy soldiers were calm. They had not had to fight hard in 8 years, and they stood with the ease of men who expected no real challenge. Othniel raised his sword and shouted to his men, "Today the Lord fights with us! Forward!" His army moved forward across the field. The two sides crashed together, swords against shields. Othniel fought near the front of his men, just as he had done many years before at the gate of Kiriath Sefer, his old strength returning to him in the heat of the fight. The enemy soldiers, who thought this would be easy, found themselves pushed back again and again, their formation breaking apart under the force of men who had everything to fight for. By the time the sun went down, the enemy army was broken and running, fleeing back toward their own land, never to come against Israel again under that king. Othniel led his men back home through the same hills they had crossed before, the mood of the camp much lighter than it had been on the way north. Word spread quickly from town to town that the enemy king was gone, that his men had fled, that the people no longer had to give away their grain and silver. People came out of their homes to watch the army walk by. Some brought water for the tired soldiers, holding jars out as the men passed. Others simply stood along the road and watched the man who had freed them pass, an old man who had picked up his sword one last time. When Othniel finally reached his own home, Achsah was waiting near the springs where she so often drew water. She set down her jar and walked toward him as he came over the last hill, and they walked the rest of the way home together, saying little, simply glad to be side by side again. The people of Israel made Othniel their judge. He stayed to help guide the people and to settle their arguments, sitting at the gate of his town many mornings, listening to the disputes brought before him and giving judgment with the same calm he had carried into battle. And as long as Othniel lived, the land was quiet. The fields were planted and gathered in peace, the grain filling the storehouses instead of foreign carts. Families lived in their homes without fear. The land had rest for 40 years.